I was 3 years into my retirement when the phone rang that night. Not the usual late-night call from an old colleague or a wrong number. This one had a tone to it, sharp and urgent, the kind that wakes you up faster than a cold shower. I almost didn't answer. I'd spent years trying to put that life behind me, burying the memories of classified missions and the sleepless nights that followed. But something, call it instinct, told me to pick up. The voice on the other end wasn't anyone I recognized. It was flat, almost rehearsed, like the guy had said those exact words 100 times before. "Colonel," he said, using my rank even though I hadn't been called that in years, "we need you to report to Groom Lake. There's been a development regarding your 1976 flight. Transportation will be arranged. 0800 hours tomorrow." I sat there in the dark, the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen filling the silence. Groom Lake. I hadn't set foot in Nevada since the program shut down. In 1976, that mission had haunted me for decades, though I'd convinced myself most of it was just the byproduct of fatigue and too many classified briefings. My first thought was that it had to be a mistake, or worse, some cruel joke. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. When you've flown the Blackbird, when you've touched the edge of space at Mach 3, you develop a sense for danger, for importance. And this call, it carried both. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat by the window of my small place in Tucson, staring out at the empty desert. Every so often, the distant headlights of trucks moved along the highway, but otherwise, the world felt still. My mind kept replaying that flight, the one they were suddenly interested in again. The mission briefings. The silent tension between me and my recon systems officer. The strange static that bled through the comms at 80,000 feet. And that fleeting glimpse of something I never dared to put in the official report. By sunrise, I'd packed a small duffel, just essentials. Old habits die hard. Travel light, no identifiers, nothing that could compromise you if things went south. At exactly 0800, a black SUV pulled up outside. The driver didn't speak. He just nodded, took my bag, and drove me straight to a small airfield outside town. The jet waiting on the tarmac wasn't anything commercial. Matte gray, unmarked, just like the ones that used to ferry us to and from test sites during the program's peak. When I stepped inside, the cabin was empty except for one man in a suit, sitting in the far corner. He didn't look at me, didn't say a word, just kept flipping through a thin folder in his hands. As we took off, I stared out the small window. The desert stretched endlessly below us, familiar and alien all at once. It struck me how much had changed in the years since I'd left that world, new wars, new faces in charge, but the air up here still smelled the same, dry, metallic, laced with the faint scent of jet fuel. 2 hours later, we descended toward Groom Lake. From the air, the base looked almost unchanged. The same runways, the same hangars baking under the Nevada sun. But as we taxied, I caught sight of something new, a cluster of structures where the old maintenance bays used to be, fenced off and surrounded by armed guards. Whatever had developed, it was big enough to warrant an entirely new section of the facility. The man in the suit finally spoke as we rolled to a stop. His voice was calm, controlled. "You'll be briefed shortly. Follow the instructions you're given, and answer their questions. That's all you need to do." I didn't reply. After all these years, I'd learned that sometimes silence is the safest response. As I stepped out onto the tarmac, the dry Nevada air hit me like a punch. It tasted the same as it did back then, dust, heat, and secrets. I followed an escort through a maze of corridors, past locked doors and coded checkpoints, until we reached a secured room. On the table inside was a folder with my name on it, in bold black letters. Seeing it there, after all these years, sent a chill through me. They still had everything, my records, my logs, even the flight tapes I thought were destroyed. I sat down, heart pounding, as the door clicked shut behind me. That's when I realized something. They weren't calling me back to reminisce. They'd found something. Something they didn't understand. And for reasons I couldn't yet grasp, they needed me to help them make sense of it. For the first time in years, I felt that same knot in my stomach, the one I used to get just before takeoff in the Blackbird. The feeling that whatever came next was going to change everything. The escort didn't say a word as we moved through the narrow hallways of the operations building. Every few steps, we passed another keypad door or a motion sensor, more layers of security than I remembered from the old days. Back then, we thought we were the most classified program in the country. Now, it felt like we were walking through a vault designed to keep out the world itself. Eventually, we stepped outside into the Nevada heat. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, broken only by the angular hangars that lined the runway. Most of them were familiar, weathered walls, rust streaks from decades of sandstorms, but at the far end of the tarmac stood a newer structure. Smooth, white, almost sterile-looking, as if it had been built yesterday. That's where they led me. Inside, the air was cool and sharp, smelling faintly of hydraulic fluid and jet fuel. I knew that smell. Every pilot who ever strapped into the Blackbird knew it. It triggered something deep in my memory, like muscle memory waking up after a long sleep. I followed the sound of footsteps echoing against the concrete floor until the hallway opened into the main hangar. And there it was. For a moment, I forgot to breathe. The State Route 71 sat in the center of the room, its black titanium skin gleaming under the harsh white lights. The years had been kind to her, almost too kind. She looked brand new, like she'd just rolled off the assembly line at Burbank. Not a scratch, not a dent, not a hint of the stress that those High-Mach flights used to carve into the airframe. I walked closer, slowly, my boots tapping against the polished floor. My reflection stared back at me from her fuselage, older, worn down, but still carrying the same awe I'd felt the first time I'd seen her decades ago. They hadn't just preserved her. They'd changed her. Near the nose, subtle markings traced along the titanium skin, fine lines, patterns that didn't belong to any maintenance schematic I'd ever known. They almost shimmered when the light hit them, like faint etchings burned into the surface. I reached out instinctively, my fingers hovering just above the metal, but stopped short. "Don't touch her," a voice said from behind me. I turned to see a man in his 40s, lab coat over a pressed shirt, clipboard in hand. He didn't look like any of the crew chiefs or engineers I used to work with. Too clean, too clinical. "Why does she look different?" I asked. He hesitated, like he was weighing how much he could tell me. "We've been studying her. Refining her. Think of it as restoration, but on a level you wouldn't have had access to back then." I glanced back at the Blackbird, my Blackbird, and felt a chill crawl up my spine. "Restoration," I repeated. "That's one way to put it." I stepped closer, circling around the aircraft. Every angle triggered another memory, night launches under a sky full of stars, the roar of the engines kicking in, the world shrinking below as we climbed past 60, 70, 80,000 feet. But there was something else now, something out of place. The tail section had been opened, panels removed to expose internal components I didn't recognize. New cabling ran along the spine, sleek and seamless, like it had always been part of the design. "What are you doing to her?" I asked, this time with more edge in my voice. The man looked down at his clipboard, avoiding my eyes. "You'll be briefed soon. For now, just reacquaint yourself. It's been a long time since you were up close." I ran a hand through my hair, frustration simmering just under the surface. This wasn't nostalgia. This wasn't about honoring an aircraft or the men who flew her. Something was happening here, something they weren't ready to put into words. The longer I stood there, the more the memories started to surface. That mission in '76. The interference on the radios. The brief but unmistakable shadow that crossed our path over the Arctic. I remembered telling my recon systems officer to mark it in the log, then thinking better of it. Too many questions. Too many eyes that didn't need to know. Now, decades later, here I was, standing in front of the same airframe, except she wasn't exactly the same. "Colonel," the escort called from near the doorway. His tone was polite but firm, the kind that doesn't invite negotiation. "They're ready for you." I nodded, tearing my gaze away from the Blackbird. As I followed him back through the hangar, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching me. It was ridiculous, I knew, but every pilot who ever sat in that cockpit swore the Blackbird had a soul, a presence. Standing there, surrounded by those strange markings and unexplained modifications, I felt it stronger than ever. Just before we stepped through the door, I turned for one last look. The hangar was silent, but in that silence, I could almost hear her engines again, the deep, guttural rumble that meant you were about to push past the limits of what most men ever experienced. Ghosts in the hangar, I thought. And as the door closed behind me, I couldn't shake the sense that whatever had brought me back here, it wasn't just about the past. It was about something buried deep in that airframe, something they had finally started to uncover. They led me into a narrow hallway that twisted deeper underground, far from the hangar and the Nevada sun. The air changed as we descended, colder, heavier, like it carried the weight of secrets. My escort said nothing, his boots clicking against the polished concrete, until we reached a steel door with no markings, only a keypad and a biometric scanner. He pressed his hand against the glass, entered a code I didn't catch, and the lock released with a soft metallic click. The door swung open, revealing a room that felt more like a bunker than a meeting space. No windows, no decorations, just a long metal table, a few chairs, and a projector humming quietly in the corner. At the far end of the table sat a man in uniform, his posture rigid but his eyes tired. Silver hair cut short, a chest full of ribbons, and that look I knew too well, the look of someone who'd spent his life signing papers that never officially existed. "Colonel," he said, standing and offering a handshake. His grip was firm, his expression unreadable. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. Please, have a seat." I sat. The escort closed the door behind me, leaving the two of us alone. The man opened a thick folder and slid a photograph across the table. Black and white, grainy, but unmistakable, the outline of the State Route 71 in flight, a contrail stretching out behind it like a silver thread across the sky. "This is you," he said. "Alaska. 1976. I felt my jaw tighten. That mission again. Always that mission. What about it? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slid another photo across. This one wasn't grainy. It was sharp, high resolution, the kind of image that only existed in classified archives. It showed something above the Blackbird, faint, almost transparent, but there. A shape that didn't match any aircraft silhouette I'd ever seen. "We recovered these images 2 months ago," he said, his voice low, controlled. "They were buried in a set of telemetry files scheduled for permanent deletion. Someone flagged them before they disappeared." I studied the photo, my stomach tightening as memories flooded back. The static in our comms. The instruments flickering for a split second. My recon systems officer swearing under his breath that something was tracking us, something we couldn't see. "This," the man continued, tapping the photo, "wasn't part of your debrief. You mentioned nothing about it in your post-flight report. Why?" I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. "Because there was nothing to report," I said. "Not officially. You think anyone back then would have believed me if I said we saw a ghost over the Arctic? We had jobs to do, Colonel. Our job wasn't to explain things that didn't make sense." His eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't push back. Instead, he opened the folder wider, revealing a stack of documents, flight logs, telemetry charts, radio transcripts. Some pages were redacted so heavily they looked like black walls of ink. "These are your comms from that night," he said, sliding a small recorder across the table. "Listen." The tape hissed for a moment, then my own voice filled the room, calm, clipped, professional. "Altitude reports, course adjustments, routine check-ins with mission control." Then, faintly, buried under the noise of the engines, another sound. Static, but patterned, almost rhythmic. Not random. I froze. I hadn't heard that sound in nearly 40 years, but the moment it played, something in me recognized it. Back then, we'd brushed it off as interference, maybe even sabotage. But hearing it now, in that quiet room, I knew better. "What is that?" I asked, my voice lower than I intended. "That," he said, leaning forward, "is what we want to know. Our analysts have run every test imaginable. It's not Russian. It's not ours. And it's not natural interference. It's a signal, Colonel. And it was transmitting during your entire flight segment north of the Aleutians." I didn't say anything. I just stared at the recorder, at that little piece of plastic and metal that now carried more weight than I could process. "There's more," he continued, sliding a final document across the table. It was a transcript, time-stamped and signed by 2 analysts. In the margins, there were notes, frantic, uncertain, but one word appeared again and again, unidentified. "We believe," he said carefully, "that whatever you encountered during that mission wasn't just following you. It was communicating. And for reasons we don't yet understand, that communication stopped the moment you returned to base. We have no other records of this signal before or after that day." I looked up at him, searching his face for some sign of what this really was, fear, excitement, anything. But his expression stayed locked, professional. "You want me to explain it," I said. "You think I know what it was?" He leaned back, folding his hands. "You were there. You were the only pilot to fly that mission. If there's even the smallest chance that you remember something, anything, that isn't in those files, we need to hear it. I opened my mouth to speak, then closed it again. What could I say? That for years, I'd woken up in the middle of the night, certain I'd forgotten something important. That sometimes, when the house was quiet and the desert winds howled outside, I could still hear that signal, faint but insistent, like an itch at the back of my mind. Instead, I said nothing. He slid the folder toward me. Take your time, he said. But understand this, we're not the only ones asking these questions. Something is moving out there, Colonel. And whatever it is, it's older than any program we've ever run. I looked down at the photos again, my hands tightening into fists. The Blackbird had always been a machine of precision, of control. But that night, in that cold Arctic sky, we hadn't been in control at all. And now, after all these years, it felt like those ghosts had finally come back to collect. The room faded as I stared at the photographs and transcripts scattered across the table. My mind drifted back to that night, to the cold steel of the cockpit and the rhythmic vibration of the engines behind me. It was strange how easily the details came rushing back, the sting of pure oxygen in my mask, the hum of the environmental system, the quiet clicks of my recon systems officer flipping switches beside me. For years, I'd convinced myself those memories were dull, harmless snapshots of a routine mission. But they weren't. Not anymore. We launched from Beale just after sunset. The sky had been a perfect gradient of orange and deep blue, fading to black as we climbed. The takeoff had been uneventful, the kind of launch we'd done dozens of times, full afterburner, nose up, and a smooth climb out. The State Route 71 didn't just fly, it felt like it detached you from the world below, like you were sliding into a different realm entirely. At 60,000 feet, the planet beneath you looks fragile, almost delicate, like it could shatter if you so much as breathed wrong. At 70,000, it doesn't even feel like Earth anymore. The horizon bends, the sky darkens to a deep indigo, and the stars begin to sharpen, cold and unwavering. But at 80,000, where we lived, that's where it all changes. You're above the weather, above the noise, above almost everything human. That night, everything felt routine until we crossed the Canadian border, heading northwest. The Arctic was quiet, nothing but black ice and the occasional glimmer of frozen ridges reflecting the moonlight. My RSO, Miller, checked in over the intercom, his voice steady. All systems nominal, he said. Telemetry clean. ETA to station point, 12 minutes. I acknowledged, eyes fixed on the instruments, one hand steady on the yoke. We'd done this route before. It was supposed to be simple, in, out, and back before anyone even knew we were there. But then the first anomaly hit. It started with a soft hiss in my headset. Not unusual, not at first. The radios on the Blackbird were powerful, but at those speeds and altitudes, interference wasn't uncommon. I adjusted the frequency, tapped the side of my helmet, and waited for it to clear. But it didn't. The hiss grew louder, rising and falling in a strange rhythm, almost like breathing. Miller, you hear that? I asked. Yeah, he said after a pause. Sounds like bleed over, but different. You want me to switch channels? Negative, I replied. Hold frequency. Let's see if it passes. But it didn't pass. The hiss settled into a steady pattern, almost like a pulse, and underneath it, faint, so faint I thought I was imagining it, there was a tone. Not a human voice. Not even static. It was more like a vibration, a deep, resonant hum that sat just at the edge of hearing. We didn't mention it again. Pilots learn to ignore a lot of things, unexplained glitches, noises that don't fit, anything that might get you grounded or sent for evaluation. But I remember how Miller shifted in his seat after that, like he'd felt it too. By the time we hit our station point over the Alaskan sector, the interference had faded, but something else had taken its place. Altitude at 82,000. Speed at Mach 3.2. Everything felt sharp, on edge, like the air around us was thinner than usual. My hands were steady, but my gut wasn't. Pilots don't talk about gut feelings in reports, they're too hard to explain, too easy to dismiss. But every man who ever flew the Blackbird had them. And that night, mine was screaming. Then Miller's voice cut through the intercom. Contact, he said, flat and clipped, like he didn't want to believe it himself. 9 o'clock low, closing fast. I turned my head, straining against the helmet, but saw nothing through the narrow canopy view. The periscope caught a flash, Just a glint of something metallic, far below us, moving at impossible speed. What the hell was that? I asked. Unknown, Miller replied. No transponder, no signature. Just there. And then, just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. No contrail. No blip on the radar. Nothing but the vast, empty silence of the Arctic night. For the next 40 minutes, we said almost nothing, our voices clipped and clinical, as if talking too much might break whatever fragile control we still had. But inside, I could feel my pulse pounding. Every time I glanced at the instruments, I half expected to see a warning light flare, some indication that whatever had brushed past us had left something behind. It wasn't until we crossed back over Canadian airspace that the radios cleared completely, the hum vanishing as suddenly as it had started. The flight back to Beale was uneventful, almost dull in comparison, but neither of us spoke about what had happened. Not during the flight. Not in the post-mission checks. Not in the debriefing. That silence wasn't because we didn't care. It was because we knew what would happen if we said the wrong thing. Pilots had been pulled from missions for less, grounded, reassigned, sometimes without explanation. The Blackbird program thrived on precision and predictability. There was no room for whatever that was. But even now, sitting in that sterile briefing room decades later, I could still feel it. The hum. The pressure in my chest at altitude. The fleeting glint of something impossible moving beneath us. The man across the table studied me carefully, as if he could read the memories in my eyes. "Colonel," he said finally, "whatever you saw that night, it wasn't an accident. And it wasn't ours. The sooner you accept that, the sooner we can get to the truth." I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell him that it had been nothing, a trick of the instruments or fatigue, anything that fit within the rules of physics and sanity. But the words wouldn't come. Because deep down, I already knew. Something had been there with us that night, in that thin layer of sky where the Earth ends and space begins. Something that didn't belong to any country, any program, any human hand. And for reasons I still couldn't understand, it had chosen to let us come home. They played the tape again. The same hiss. The same pulse. That strange rhythm buried so deep in the static it almost sounded alive. The room was silent except for that eerie sound, and yet it felt like the walls themselves were listening. I'd heard it before, once, at 80,000 feet over the Arctic, when the world below us was nothing but frozen nothingness in a black sky full of stars. I had buried that memory for decades, telling myself it was interference, or maybe my brain playing tricks after too many long flights. But sitting there now, in that underground room, the sound made my hands tighten against my knees. "This is the original recording from your 1976 mission," the analyst said. His voice was calm, but I caught the faint tremor he tried to hide. "No alterations, no enhancements. Just your comm channel, isolated." I leaned closer to the small speaker on the table. The hiss faded in and out, and then the pulse began again. Steady. Too steady to be random. "Play the enhanced version," the colonel ordered. The analyst nodded, queued up another file, and pressed play. This time, the sound was sharper, cleaner. The pulse wasn't just a pulse anymore, it had structure, like a signal trying to form words. Not in any language I knew, but with intent. Patterns, pauses, tones that rose and fell like some kind of code. "What do you hear, Colonel?" the man across from me asked. I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. "It's deliberate," I said finally. "Not interference. Not bleed over. Someone, or something, was transmitting." The analyst exchanged a quick look with the colonel, then slid a printout across the table. Rows of numbers and frequency bands, notes scribbled in the margins. "We've run this signal through every filter, every decryption protocol we have," he said. "It doesn't match any known transmission, military or civilian. Not from that time, not from now. The pattern repeats every 19 seconds, with slight modulation." I stared at the page. Rows and rows of data, meaningless to me but heavy with implication. "Why keep this buried for decades?" I asked. "Why now?" The colonel leaned back in his chair, his face a mask of controlled tension. "Because until recently, we didn't know what we were looking at. We filed it away as an anomaly, equipment error, maybe even sabotage. But 6 months ago, during a classified test in the Pacific, we picked up the exact same signal. Same frequency. Same pattern. Different location." My stomach tightened. "We're in the Pacific. Classified, he said, his tone sharp enough to end that line of questioning. What matters is this: whatever transmitted that signal during your mission, it's still out there. I let that sink in, the hum from the tape echoing faintly in my mind. After all these years, it hadn't been an isolated event. It hadn't been a ghost in the machine. Miller would have understood. He'd heard it too that night, though we never spoke of it after we landed. He'd given me a look in the cockpit during shutdown, a look that said, "We'll never talk about this again." And we didn't. The colonel slid another photo toward me. It showed a bank of modern equipment, rows of monitors and spectral analyzers. On one screen, the same waveform that had been pulled from our flight recorder decades ago. Below it, a second waveform, identical. "We need you to help us reconstruct everything from that mission," he said. "Every detail. Every deviation from protocol. Every anomaly, no matter how small." I almost laughed. "You think after all this time I'm going to remember something you don't already have in your files?" The colonel didn't flinch. Memory works in strange ways. Sometimes it just needs the right trigger. And we think we found one. He motioned to the analyst, who pulled out a small black case and set it on the table. Inside was a sleek, high-tech headset, far more advanced than anything from my flying days. "It's a simulation interface," the analyst explained. "It will allow you to experience that mission as it happened, with every second of telemetry and cockpit audio synced in real time. Think of it as flying it again." I looked at the device, my throat dry. Part of me wanted to refuse, to walk away from all of it. But another part, deeper, heavier, needed to know. Needed to understand what had been chasing us that night, what had been trying to speak. "Why me?" I asked quietly. "There were other pilots. Other missions." The colonel's gaze hardened. "Because this one started with you. And because whatever this is, Colonel, it remembers." The room fell silent again, the weight of his words pressing down like the high-altitude cabin pressure I used to feel above the Arctic. I glanced back at the waveform printout, at that jagged pattern frozen in black ink. For decades, it had been just another mystery locked away in a vault. Now, it was knocking again, louder, closer. I didn't want to admit it, but the sound in that tape had never really left me. I'd hear it in the hum of the refrigerator late at night, in the whine of an old radio picking up static during a storm. I told myself it was nothing. That it was over. But as I sat there in that cold, sterile room, I realized the truth. It had never been over. And whatever had sent that signal all those years ago, it had been waiting for me to hear it again. The cold above Alaska was different from anywhere else we flew. At 80,000 feet, it was the kind of cold that didn't just bite, it lingered, like a presence you couldn't see but could feel pressing against the skin under your suit. That night, the darkness stretched endlessly in every direction, broken only by the soft glow of the instruments and the quiet hum of the Blackbird as it cruised at Mach 3. Miller was on the stick, his hands steady, eyes locked on the horizon we couldn't even see. I handled the systems, checking telemetry, fuel, and comms, the usual dance we'd rehearsed 1,000 times. It should have been routine. It never was. Not over Alaska. We'd been scrambled out of Beale on short notice, one of those calls that came with no explanation and no room for questions. Just coordinates, flight path, and strict radio silence. By the time we'd cleared Canadian airspace and started our climb, I could tell this wasn't about tracking Soviet bombers or monitoring test launches. There was a tension in the briefing officer's voice that hadn't left me since we left the ground. 2 hours into the flight, it started. "Signal spike, channel 3, I said, glancing at the scope. The readout blinked with a faint, rhythmic pulse. Miller didn't look away from the instruments. "Same as before?" I hesitated. "Close. Different frequency, but the pattern's almost identical." I didn't have to explain what I meant. Both of us remembered the Arctic mission, the one that left us with more questions than answers in a recording that nobody could explain. I adjusted the gain, isolating the signal. The pulse grew sharper, almost deliberate. 19 seconds apart, like clockwork. Then, for the first time, there was a voice. Not words, exactly, more like a whisper carried on a storm, distorted and metallic. But it was there, threading through the static, impossible to dismiss. "Say again?" Miller asked, tilting his head slightly as if that would help him hear it. I replayed it, my finger hovering over the switch. The whisper came again, this time clearer, though still not in any language I recognized. Could be a weather station, Miller offered, but his tone betrayed him. He didn't believe it. Neither did I. We were over the Yukon now, the Blackbird slicing through the stratosphere like a blade. Below us, the world was a frozen wasteland. No lights, no signs of life, just endless ice and shadow. Then the radar blinked. "Contact," I said, my voice tight. "Bearing 220, high altitude. Range, adjusting. Speed unknown." Miller's hands tightened on the yoke. "Altitude?" "Above us," I said. That alone was impossible. Nothing we knew of could get higher than we were, not at those speeds. For a few seconds, the contact held steady, pacing us. Then it was gone, no trail, no fade, just gone. "Probably a glitch," Miller muttered, but I could hear the edge in his voice. We kept climbing, the Blackbird eating up the miles, until the Yukon gave way to the empty sweep of the Arctic Ocean. That's when the comms went dead. Not static. Not interference. Just silence. I cycled the systems, ran every diagnostic I could. Everything showed green. Everything should have been working. But there was nothing, no tower, no command, no backup frequency. It was like the world below had simply gone quiet. Then the hum started. Deep, low, and steady. It didn't come from the engines or any system I could track. It came from everywhere, through the fuselage, through the headset, through the bones in my chest. Miller glanced at me, eyes wide behind the visor, but said nothing. For 30 seconds, maybe longer, we just listened. The hum rose and fell, pulsing like a heartbeat, until, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The comms came back with a burst of static so loud it made us both flinch. Tower control was yelling for us, their voices sharp with panic. They'd lost our transponder, lost our signal, for nearly 9 minutes. But we hadn't been gone. Not to us. The flight home was silent, both of us running through what had happened, neither willing to say it out loud. When we landed, the crew swarmed the Blackbird, running checks, asking questions we didn't have answers to. The debrief was short and cold. They wanted details, timestamps, readouts, every anomaly. They took the flight recorder and our suits for analysis. And then, just like that, it was over. Classified. Buried. But I couldn't shake it. Not the signal. Not the contact that had paced us. Not the hum that felt less like a sound and more like something alive, something that had noticed us. Weeks later, Miller cornered me in the hangar. He didn't look like he'd slept in days. "You've heard it since, haven't you?" he asked. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. "It's not just the flights," he said quietly. "It's everywhere now. In the radio. In the house. In my head." I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that it was stress or fatigue or something rational. But deep down, I knew he wasn't. Whatever had been waiting for us high over Alaska that night, whatever had reached out through the static and silence, hadn't let go. And I was starting to wonder if it ever would. There's a point above the world where you stop feeling like you're flying and start feeling like you're falling through the void. At 80,000 feet, there's no blue in the sky, no horizon, no sense of up or down, just the black, infinite stretch of space above and the faint curve of the earth far below. I used to love that feeling. After that night, I never looked at it the same way again. The mission had been routine, at least, that's what they told us. A high-altitude reconnaissance run skirting the edges of international airspace, in and out before anyone knew we were there. Miller and I had done hundreds like it. We trusted the bird, we trusted each other, and we trusted the men in the briefing room to tell us everything we needed to know. That trust ended at 2:14 hours, somewhere over the North Pacific. We were cruising at Mach 3.1, steady and smooth, when the first anomaly hit. It wasn't anything dramatic, just a flicker on the threat receiver, a blip that shouldn't have been there. I checked the scope, recalibrated, and got nothing. "Ghost signal," I said, more to convince myself than Miller. He didn't answer. He just kept his eyes locked on the instruments, jaw tight under the helmet. He'd seen it too. Minutes later, it happened again. Same blip. Same frequency. This time it held steady. "Tower, this is Habu 2-1, we're getting an unidentified ping, 210 bearing, closing fast," I said into the comms. Silence. "Towers don't sleep," Miller muttered. I tried again, switched frequencies. Nothing. Not static, not distortion, nothing. like the world below had vanished. That's when the turbulence started. Not the kind you feel in storms or pressure shifts. This was different. It was sharp, erratic, like something massive had displaced the air around us. The Blackbird shuddered, instruments flickering, alarms chirping in protest. Fuel flow spiking, I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. Engine 2's reading off scale. Hold it, Miller barked, hands gripping the yoke. We're riding it out. Then the radar lit up. At first, I thought it was a glitch, an artifact. But the contact was real. It was closing on us from behind at impossible speed, moving faster than anything that should have been in the sky. MiG? Miller asked. No way, I said. Not at this altitude, not at this speed. We both stared at the scope as the dot closed the gap. And then, just as it reached our 6 o'clock, the cockpit went dark. Not a power failure. Not a system shutdown. Just darkness. The instruments still glowed faintly, but the stars, the curve of the Earth, even the faint glow of the atmosphere, gone. It was like we'd been pulled into a void. For what felt like minutes, there was nothing. No sound but our own breathing. No sensation of movement, even though the Blackbird was still screaming through the stratosphere. Then we heard it. A tone, low, steady, pulsing through the hull, through our bones. It wasn't mechanical. It wasn't anything I could explain. It felt deliberate. Miller's voice cut through the intercom, tight and strained. We're not alone. I wanted to tell him to shut up, to keep his mind on the instruments, but the words stuck in my throat. He wasn't wrong. The tone grew louder, higher, until it was almost painful. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The cockpit flooded with light, the stars snapped back into place, and the scope went blank. We didn't speak for the rest of the flight. When we landed at Kadena, the ground crew swarmed the bird like always, but their smiles faded fast when they pulled the flight recorder. It was blank. Not corrupted, not damaged, just empty. Like those 9 minutes had never happened. The debrief was worse than the flight. A room full of stone-faced officers asking the same questions over and over. What did you see? What did you hear? How long were you in the anomaly? When we told them about the tone, they exchanged glances but wrote nothing down. When we pushed for answers, they shut it down. Classified, they said. Need to know. They grounded us for a week after that. Said it was to inspect the aircraft, but I knew better. They were watching us, testing us. Waiting to see if we'd crack. Miller didn't sleep during that week. I'd find him in the hangar, staring at the Blackbird like it had betrayed him. You know it wasn't mechanical, he said one night, his voice hoarse. I wanted to argue, to tell him we'd hit some freak atmospheric anomaly, but I couldn't. Not after what I'd felt in that cockpit. Weeks later, we were cleared for flight again. Another mission, another run, same routine. But every time we climbed past 70,000 feet, every time the horizon fell away and the black swallowed us whole, I found myself holding my breath, waiting for that tone. It never came back. But sometimes, when the night is quiet and the house is still, I swear I can hear it again, low and steady, just at the edge of hearing. And every time, I remember that feeling from 80,000 feet, the cold certainty that something out there had noticed us. And that maybe, just maybe, it hadn't let go. They didn't let us go home after the incident. The moment the Blackbird's wheels touched the runway at Kadena, Miller and I were pulled aside. No explanations, no questions, just a silent escort into a windowless building at the edge of the base that I'd only seen from a distance. Inside, the air was cold, dry, and smelled faintly of ozone. The guards didn't look at us. They didn't need to. We were separated immediately. Miller was taken down a different corridor, his helmet still under his arm, eyes darting back to me like a man walking into a storm. They led me to a small room, white walls, a metal table, and a single chair bolted to the floor. The only other furniture was a camera in the corner, its red light already blinking. I sat there for almost an hour before anyone came in. The man who finally entered wasn't in uniform. He wore a dark suit and carried a thin folder under his arm. His face was forgettable, his voice even more so. You had an irregularity during your last mission, he said, sitting across from me. Tell me everything. So, I did. From the first flicker on the scope to the tone in the cockpit to the dead recorder when we landed. I kept my voice steady, kept it clinical. Pilots are trained to report facts, not feelings. But he didn't care about the facts. "Describe the sound," he said. "It wasn't mechanical," I told him. "It wasn't interference or feedback. It felt intentional. Like it was directed at us." "Could you replicate it?" "No," I said. "I wouldn't even know where to start." He made a note in his folder, not looking up. "And your co-pilot?" "Miller heard it too." Another note. No reaction. Then came the questions I didn't expect. What had we seen in the cockpit? Did we experience disorientation, nausea, confusion? Did we lose time? Did we feel like we were being observed? That last word stuck with me. Observed. I answered honestly. Yes, there were minutes we couldn't account for. No, we couldn't explain it. And yes, I felt like something was out there, focused on us. When I finished, he closed the folder. "You'll be grounded until further notice," he said flatly. "Your aircraft will undergo a full inspection. You are not to discuss this with anyone, including your co-pilot. Do you understand?" I wanted to argue, but the way he said it, calm, cold, final, made it clear there was no room for debate. I didn't see Miller again until the next morning. He looked worse than I'd ever seen him, eyes red, jaw clenched, hands trembling just enough to notice. "They asked me the same questions," he said quietly, when we finally found a moment alone in the hangar. "And then they told me to forget it." "Forget it?" I repeated. He nodded. "Like it never happened. Like we imagined it." But we hadn't imagined it. The fuel spike, the instruments failing, the tone, it was all too real. 2 days later, they flew us to a facility stateside. I never saw the signage, but I remember the drive-in, miles of empty desert, then a compound ringed with tall fences and men with rifles. Inside, the debrief shifted from questions to something else. Tests. Psychological evaluations. Medical scans. They drew blood, ran us through cognitive drills, even tested our reflexes. Every result, they said, was within acceptable parameters, but their faces told a different story. One night, I woke up in the barracks to find a man in a lab coat standing over my bunk, holding a small device that looked like a tape recorder. He didn't say a word, just noted something on a clipboard and left. By the 5th day, I'd stopped asking questions. When they finally released us, it was as if the incident had been erased from history. No mention in the logs. No notation in the mission records. The Blackbird itself had been stripped down, inspected, and reassembled, but the maintenance crew was under orders not to speak to us. The only thing they left untouched was the flight recorder, still blank, as if those 9 minutes had never existed. Back at Kadena, we tried to return to routine, but something had changed. The birds still roared, the sky still opened up above 80,000 feet, but the trust was gone. I'd look at the instruments and wonder if they were telling the whole story. I'd look at Miller and see the same questions in his eyes. A month later, during another pre-flight briefing, I caught a glimpse of that same man in the suit, standing in the corner, silent, observing. When I looked again, he was gone. Miller started drinking more after that. Not enough to get grounded, but enough that I noticed. He'd stare out at the runway for hours, hands shaking, muttering about the tone. He said it still woke him up some nights, sharp and clear, like we were still up there, trapped in that black void. I never admitted it, but I heard it too. Years later, long after the program ended and the Blackbird was retired, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was clipped, professional. "You never spoke about the incident," the man said. "No," I replied. "Good," he said. "Keep it that way." Then the line went dead. Sometimes, when I think about that night, I wonder if we stumbled into something we were never meant to see, or if it found us on purpose. And every time, I remember the look in Miller's eyes when we stepped off that plane, not fear, not confusion, but the quiet, heavy realization that some things in the sky aren't meant to be understood. The official flight log says we were in the air for 2 hours and 47 minutes. That's what the mission record shows, that's what the ground crew confirms, and that's what the clock on the dash read when we landed. But I know that's not true. There are 4 hours, missing from that night, and nobody will talk about it. It was supposed to be a simple reconnaissance run along the edge of the Arctic. The kind of mission we'd flown dozens of times, quiet, surgical, nothing unexpected. We left Beale just after midnight, the Blackbird slicing through the sky like it always did, smooth and steady. Miller was in the back seat, running the usual systems checks, while I climbed us to 80,000 feet, the world below shrinking into a blur of clouds and distant coastlines. For the first hour, everything was textbook. Communications were clear, the engines were steady, and the instruments were rock solid. Then, somewhere north of Fairbanks, it started. The first thing I noticed was the static in the headset. At first, I thought it was just interference, maybe from the terrain or the cold air mass we were pushing through. But then the autopilot twitched, a tiny correction to the right, like it was compensating for something that wasn't there. "Miller, you seeing this?" I asked. "Yeah," he said, his voice tight. "Sensors are fine, but the navigation keeps recalibrating. It's like we're being pulled off course." I disengaged the autopilot and flew manual, keeping her level and on heading. For a few minutes, it worked. Then the static in my headset changed. It wasn't noise anymore, it was a tone. Low, steady, and rhythmic, pulsing every 2 seconds like a signal trying to break through. I tried to call it in, but the radio was dead. Not static, dead. Miller started reading out numbers, trying to triangulate our position with what little data we still had, but even his systems were scrambled. Ground radar wasn't seeing us, either. And then, nothing. I don't mean we blacked out, not exactly. I just mean there's nothing there. 1 second we're north of Alaska, instruments going haywire, and the next I'm staring at the horizon, the cockpit calm, the gauge is steady, the tone gone. Except the clock didn't make sense. It read 0643 hours. We'd left Beale at 0002. That should have put us somewhere near the Canadian coast, maybe Greenland if we'd pushed hard. But the star map on the NAV screen showed us hundreds of miles off where we should have been, floating high over the Pacific, just west of Washington state. Did we turn around?" Miller asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't answer, because I didn't have one. By the time we landed, the ground crew looked confused but didn't ask questions. They logged the mission as successful, recorded our airtime, and moved on like nothing had happened. It wasn't until I checked my watch in the locker room that it really hit me. 4 hours. Gone. The next morning, we were called in for a routine debrief. The man waiting for us wasn't part of our usual team. He wore the same dark suit I'd seen once before during another incident, the same unreadable expression. "There was a systems malfunction," he said, before we'd even sat down. "Telemetry shows nothing unusual. Your logs are clean. You'll file your reports as standard." "What about the time discrepancy?" I asked. "There is no discrepancy," he said flatly. Miller leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "We lost 4 hours out there," he said. "We didn't imagine it. We didn't dream it. Something happened." The man didn't even blink. "This conversation is over. You're dismissed." After that, the warnings started. Quiet, offhand remarks from people we didn't know. A phone call late at night with no one on the other end, just silence. And once, a letter in my mailbox with a single line typed in black ink, "For your own good, stop asking." I tried to focus on the missions, tried to put it behind me, but the gaps wouldn't go away. Little things would trigger them. A certain frequency in the engine hum, the way the stars looked on a moonless night, even the smell of the flight suit. It all brought me back to that stretch of missing time. And then the dreams started. Not nightmares exactly, just fragments. Being weightless. A light so bright it burned through my eyelids. A voice, not words, just a presence, telling me to remember. Miller didn't talk about it much, but I could tell it was eating at him too. He started keeping a notebook, jotting down times, coordinates, bits of data that didn't add up. One night, after too many drinks, he told me he'd woken up in his apartment with blood on his collar and no memory of how it got there. "They know what happened," he said, his voice shaking. "They just don't want us to." Years later, long after the program shut down, I got my personnel file through a quiet favor. Most of it was what you'd expect, flight hours, mission logs, commendations. But one page stopped me cold. Under the entry for that mission, where the airtime should have been, someone had typed a single word in bold letters, "classified." No numbers. No explanation. Just that word. I don't know what happened during those missing hours. Maybe I never will. But sometimes, when the house is quiet and the world outside is still, I swear I can hear that tone again, low, steady, pulsing every 2 seconds, like a reminder that whatever found us that night isn't finished with me yet. I'd been to Groom Lake more times than I could count. By the mid-80s, it felt almost routine: land, refuel, run systems checks, sit through the usual briefings. The Blackbird always drew stares, even from the crews who'd seen it 100 times. But that night was different. We'd just returned from a mission over the Pacific, a high-speed run that tested every limit of the aircraft. When we taxied off the runway, instead of guiding us to the usual maintenance bay, the ground crew signaled us toward the far side of the base. No explanation, no chatter on the radio. Just a hand motion, sharp and deliberate, telling us to follow the jeep leading the way. The hangar they brought us to wasn't one I recognized. It was half buried into the desert, the entry marked only by a faded stencil, B-12. The doors slid open without a sound, revealing an elevator platform big enough to hold the entire State Route 71. Miller and I exchanged a look, but nobody said a word. As the platform lowered, the desert disappeared above us, replaced by cold, humming concrete walls. The air down there smelled different, sterile, metallic, and faintly like ozone. The deeper we went, the more I realized how large the facility was. This wasn't just a maintenance bay, it was something much bigger, something meant to stay hidden. When the platform locked into place, a group of men in dark gray uniforms appeared. No names, no insignias, just clipboards and hard stares. One of them pointed toward a narrow hallway and said, "You'll be debriefed first. The aircraft will be handled." Miller opened his mouth to protest. Nobody handled the Blackbird without our oversight, but I put a hand on his arm. Something told me this wasn't the place to argue. The hallway led to a room with no windows and a single table bolted to the floor. 2 chairs on our side, one on theirs. After a few minutes, the door opened and a man in a black suit stepped in. He looked older than the usual intelligence officers we dealt with, his hair thinning and his face pale under the fluorescent lights. "You're here because of what you saw," he said, without even introducing himself. I frowned. "We saw plenty. You'll have to be more specific." He slid a file across the table. Inside were high-altitude photos from our mission, the kind of images only the State Route 71 could capture. Most of them were what I expected: ocean, empty sky, the faint outline of coastlines. But one frame was different. In the center of the shot, just above the waterline, was something wrong. A perfect black circle, darker than anything around it, with no shadow, no reflection, no definition. "What is that?" Miller asked. The man didn't answer. Instead, he closed the folder and leaned forward. "From this point on, you will not speak of what you've seen. Not to your families, not to your crew, not even to each other. The report you file will omit frame 17. Do you understand?" I opened my mouth to argue, but the look in his eyes froze me. It wasn't anger. It was fear. When they finally released us, I expected to find the Blackbird parked and ready, like always. Instead, the aircraft was gone. "They're running diagnostics," one of the gray-uniformed men said when I asked. "You'll get it back in the morning." We were escorted to a set of dorm-like quarters, bare rooms with thin mattresses and no clocks. It felt less like a place to rest and more like a holding cell. At some point during the night, I woke up to the sound of something heavy being moved below us. Not the usual clang of tools or hydraulic lifts, but a deep, rolling vibration that shook the walls. I crept to the small vent above the bed and listened. Voices carried through, muffled but urgent. I couldn't make out words, but I recognized Miller's voice among them, sharp and angry. By morning, he wouldn't talk about it. "They wanted to know about the readings," was all he said. "The telemetry we picked up before the shot. Just leave it." When we were finally brought back to the hangar floor, the State Route 71 was sitting there like nothing had happened. Freshly fueled, systems humming, ready for takeoff. But there were new markings on her fuselage, tiny, almost invisible etchings near the engine nacelles. Maintenance crews never touched her without us, and yet there they were. On the flight back to Beale, neither of us said a word. The mission recorder showed nothing unusual, no missing frames, no gaps in the telemetry. According to the official data, that black circle in frame 17 didn't exist. Weeks later, a quiet memo came down from command. It wasn't an order, not exactly, but a reminder that operational security extended to unverified anomalies encountered during missions. Failure to comply, it said, would be considered a breach of classified protocols. Miller grew restless after that. He'd sit in the hangar after hours, staring at the Blackbird like it was keeping secrets from him. I caught him once with a stack of schematics spread out on the table, tracing lines around the sensor arrays with his finger. "They did something to her," he muttered. "I can feel it. She's different now." I wanted to tell him he was imagining things, that it was just the stress, but deep down, I felt it too. The next mission, she handled differently, sharper, quieter, almost like she anticipated my movements before I made them. Months turned into years, and that night in the underground hangar faded into a quiet corner of my memory. But sometimes, when I hear a low hum in a quiet room or catch the faint scent of ozone after a storm, it all comes rushing back, the elevator sinking into the earth, the black circle in the photo, the look in that man's eyes. I don't know what's under Groom Lake, and I don't think I want to. But whatever it is, it's been there a long time. And the Blackbird, for all her speed and brilliance, was just another tool for something far bigger than any of us ever understood. I knew from the moment I woke up that morning that something about the day felt wrong. The base was quieter than usual, almost subdued, and the crews moved with a kind of tension I'd only seen before combat runs. No chatter, no jokes, just silent nods and clipped answers. When I got to the briefing room, the mood didn't improve. Miller was already there, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the mission folder in front of him. He didn't look up when I sat down. Across the table, two men in black suits and nondescript badges studied us with expressions as cold as stone. The lead officer cleared his throat, slid a single-page briefing across the table, and said, "This will be your last operational sortie. Wheels up at 0400. You'll have your coordinates on climb out." No explanation. No objective. Just a set of instructions and the kind of silence that told us questions weren't welcome. I'd flown the Blackbird more times than I could count, but that day she felt different under my hands. The moment I powered up, there was a hum through the controls that hadn't been there before. Miller noticed it too. I could see it in the way his jaw tightened as we taxied out. Takeoff was smooth, too smooth. The engines roared, the desert blurred, and in seconds we were climbing at an angle that would have snapped the spine of any other aircraft. The radio stayed dead silent, save for a single transmission from Groom Lake: "Proceed to Vector Delta 7. Do not deviate." We punched past Mach 3 in record time, the skin of the Blackbird glowing faintly as we tore through the upper atmosphere. But something was off. The altimeter flickered for a moment, just a glitch, maybe, and the navigation systems pulsed like they were syncing to something we didn't control. Miller leaned toward me, his voice low through the intercom. "She's flying herself." I wanted to argue, but he was right. The Blackbird's responses were sharper, faster, almost anticipating every move before we made it. It wasn't just that she was performing better, it was like she had a purpose, one we didn't understand. The coordinates took us far beyond our usual corridors, over empty stretches of ocean where even the satellites didn't bother to look. That's when we saw it, a perfect circle below, blacker than the water, the same kind of void we'd captured in those photos months ago. "Altitude hold," Miller said, his voice tight. But before I could confirm, the aircraft dipped, just slightly, just enough to make it clear that it wasn't my decision. Then the telemetry spiked. Every dial in the cockpit lit up, warnings flashing and alarms screaming, but the engines didn't falter. It felt like we were being pulled forward, locked onto something invisible. For a moment, the horizon bent, the sky itself curving in ways that made my stomach twist. And then, silence. Every system went dead: lights, comms, instruments. Only the hum of the engines remained, steady and strong, as the world outside the canopy turned impossibly still. The ocean below shimmered, not like water but like liquid glass, and the black circle widened, swallowing everything around it. I don't know how long we were in that space, seconds, minutes, maybe hours. Time didn't feel real anymore. Miller was shouting something, but I couldn't hear him. All I could focus on was the strange vibration running through the fuselage, like the Blackbird was communicating. And then, just as suddenly, it was over. The systems came back online, the horizon snapped into place, and we were hundreds of miles from where we'd been, the ocean calm and empty beneath us. "Return to base," a voice said over the radio. Not control, not anyone we recognized, just a voice, flat and mechanical, giving a single command. We landed in silence. The crews didn't swarm the aircraft like they usually did. Instead, a team in gray suits appeared, guiding the Blackbird into that same underground hangar. Miller and I were escorted to separate rooms, each with a single chair and a single camera staring us down. The debrief was short. They asked about the instruments, about the readings, about anything unusual we'd seen. But the moment I mentioned the blackout, their eyes changed. One of the suits leaned forward, voice like ice. There was no blackout. Do you understand? I signed the papers they pushed in front of me, statements I didn't write, words I didn't believe, and when they released me, the hangar was empty. The Blackbird was gone. Days turned into weeks with no word. Miller stopped answering calls, stopped coming to the base. Rumors swirled, transfer, reassignment, maybe worse, but nobody gave me answers. Then, one night, a plain envelope appeared in my mailbox. No return address, no markings, just a single sheet of paper inside. On it, a set of coordinates I didn't recognize in 4 words, written in block letters: "She is still flying." I never saw the Blackbird again. Officially, she'd been retired, placed in museums, her missions declassified and her legacy sealed in history books. But sometimes, late at night, when the sky is clear and the wind is still, I swear I hear her, just a faint roar, high above where no one can reach, flying faster and farther than anyone believes. And in those moments, I wonder if that final flight wasn't the end at all. Maybe it was just the beginning of something none of us were ever meant to understand. I thought walking away would be the easy part. The Blackbird was gone, Miller had vanished, and the program was officially over. They told me to forget everything, to focus on living a normal life. But the thing about the Blackbird is that it never really lets you go. You close your eyes at night and you still hear the engines, that deep, steady hum that you feel more than you hear. And sometimes, you swear you can still feel the weight of her stick in your hands, guiding you through the thin edges of the atmosphere. Months passed before the first sign came. It was a quiet evening at my house in Nevada, the desert stretching out under a cold, clear sky. I was sitting on the porch when I heard it, faint, distant, but unmistakable. The Blackbird. The pitch was too perfect, the timing too precise to be anything else. I stepped off the porch, scanning the sky, but there was nothing. No contrail, no light, just the empty silence of the high desert. 2 days later, the second envelope arrived. Like the first, it had no return address, no markings. Inside was a single photograph, a satellite image of a remote airstrip in Alaska, half buried in snow. And there she was. The Blackbird. My Blackbird. Not in a museum, not in pieces, alive. You could see the shimmer of the titanium in the winter light, her lines too sharp to be anything else. Below the photo, a single line of text in block letters: "You were never done." I should have burned it. Tossed it in the fire and walked away. But that's not who I am, and whoever sent that letter knew it. A week later, I was on a flight north, telling myself it was curiosity, not obsession. But deep down, I knew the truth: I needed to see her again. Anchorage was cold, unforgiving, the kind of cold that bites through your bones. I rented a truck and drove for hours, following roads that weren't even on the maps. The coordinates from the photograph took me to the edge of nowhere, a narrow trail leading through frozen forest, ending at a chain-link fence topped with rusted barbed wire. There were no guards, no cameras, nothing to suggest anyone cared what lay beyond. But inside, tucked into a hangar barely visible from the road, was the shape I'd know anywhere. The Blackbird. She sat there like a predator at rest, her matte black surface absorbing the dim winter light, her presence so commanding it froze me in place. I stepped closer, my breath fogging in the icy air, and for a moment, I could almost believe she recognized me. The paint along her nose was different, newer, sharper. They'd been flying her. Not just maintaining her, but pushing her farther than we ever had. That's when I heard the voice behind me. "You shouldn't be here." I turned, but the man standing there didn't look like security. He wasn't armed, at least not visibly. He wore a heavy parka, his face hidden by a hood and a scarf, but his posture told me he knew exactly who I was. "Why?" I asked. My voice cracked in the cold. "Why keep her alive? Why keep flying her?" He didn't answer right away. He just stared at the Blackbird, like he was weighing how much I deserved to know. Finally, he said, "Because some things don't end. Not when they're still needed." I wanted to press him, to demand answers, but before I could, he was gone, slipping back into the trees without leaving so much as a trail. I stayed there until the last light faded, staring at her in the dim glow from the hangar. Part of me wanted to climb in, to take her up one more time, to feel that impossible speed and silence again. But something in my gut told me that wasn't why I was there. They weren't keeping her alive for me. When I left, I half expected someone to follow me, to stop me before I made it back to Anchorage. But no one did. By the time my flight touched down in Nevada, I'd almost convinced myself it had all been a hallucination, some elaborate trick of a restless mind. Then came the third envelope. This one wasn't a photograph. It was a data sheet, engine performance readings, telemetry logs, numbers that made no sense. Altitudes beyond anything we'd reached, velocities that should have torn her apart. And at the bottom, a signature I hadn't seen in almost a year. Miller. The message was simple: she's not done. Neither are you. I don't know what they're doing with her now. I don't know if the flights are still reconnaissance, or something else entirely. But sometimes, late at night, I'll hear that sound again, faint but clear, high above the desert sky. And I know, without a doubt, that somewhere out there, beyond the reach of radar and reason, the Blackbird is still flying. I also know this: the secrets we carried, the things we saw, the missions we flew, they're not buried. They're out there, moving through classified reports, whispered about in rooms without windows, hidden in data no one outside the program will ever see. And maybe that's for the best. Some truths aren't meant to be understood. Some machines aren't meant to rest. I've stopped looking for answers. But I can't stop listening. Because one day, I think, the Blackbird will come for me. And when she does, I'll be ready.